You are listening to the IoT For All Media Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the IoT For All podcast on the IoT For All Media Network. I'm your host, Ryan Chacon, one of the co-creators of IoT For All. Now, before we jump into this episode, please don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or join our newsletter at iotforall.com/newsletter to catch all the newest episodes as soon as they come out. Are you tired of overspending on data plans? Do you need more consistent coverage? Are you over-negotiating complicated contracts? Well, Simon IoT gets it. That's why they offer customized, transparent data services across the globe. With flexible contracts, taxes, and fees included in one simple price, and user-friendly data management, your data is in your control. Their LTE SIM cards are scalable to your needs regardless of the industry you're in or the devices you need connected. Learn more at simoniot.com/IFA. So, without further ado, please enjoy this episode of the IoT For All podcast. Welcome, Vincent, to the IoT For All show. Thanks for being here this week.
Hey, Ryan. Nice to meet you, and great to be on air.
Yeah, I'm very excited about this conversation. Looking forward to it. Let's start off by having you give a quick introduction to about yourself to our audience, background, experience, any stories from the past that would be relevant to our audience to get a better sense of who we're listening to.
Sure. My name is Vincent Korstanje. I worked at ARM for the last 20 years. And in the last 5 years at ARM, we were looking at IoT, really obviously very important, but also the security angle. And the initiative we took in ARM around security angle led to a new product we've created in a company called Kigen. And that company called Kigen is being spun out of ARM to stand on its own and help cellular IoT initially to make sure that we got really good security baked in and designed in from the start.
Fantastic. So let's talk a little bit more about Kigen itself as a company and what you all do, kind of the focus of the company, general overview, the role you all play in IoT, all that kind of good stuff.
Great. That's great. So I think it's very much going to the heart of security, because security starts with identity. Identity is effectively the master key of the device, if you will, the master key of your asset. And identity is really important when it comes to security, because that identifies and decrypts the communication to the device. So what we thought about when we think about identity, we think, well, there's a couple of technologies in the market that are really strong. And one of the technology is the SIM card. And the SIM card is strong and trusted because now we all use our banking app. Our banking app very often wants a two-factor authentication, and that's effectively based in the SIM technology. So when we're thinking about IoT, and we think, okay, well, how can we use that SIM? And there's a standard emerging called eSIM, where they take the SIM out of the little tray on the side and actually, solder it down to the board. That's really nice, and you can close the tray because that's for an IoT device very inconvenient. And we kind of went, okay, well, if you do that onto the board, so you can actually integrate this into the chip. This is where the ARM heritage comes. ARM is a supplier of silicon IP, very much kind of used to help integrate larger companies' different systems onto one chip. And we thought, well, we can do the same with the SIM, integrate it onto the chip, and it's comes something like an iSIM. And the nice thing of that is much smaller form factor, much better battery life, and a lot cheaper as well. So you can think about these things no longer having the big physical thing on the side, but actually really cheap everywhere. And we believe that now identity can be very strongly defended by that iSIM. Now, as a company, we're probably about 130, 140 people. Obviously, now that's quite a big startup, but we believe that security is really important. So you need to invest. There are very high standards with the GSMA on how to keep the SIMs secure, how to keep the eSIM and iSIM secure. And that's something that we're working on. And we really have seen a lot of traction recently as people can realize the power of the SIM. And I'm sure we can talk a little bit more about it later in the interview.
Yeah, tell me a little bit more about the security piece. We talk about security here on the podcast a decent amount, but not really as it connects to the connectivity and the SIM side of things. So tell me a little bit more about kind of what that means, what it entails when we're talking about SIM security, how it's being done or how it's been done in the past, and kind of, what's being done now and why it's so important.
Yeah, well, identity is important for anything, right? So identity is used for multiple things, the device identity, but the other use of it is network identity. And obviously the big MNOs have for years been defending the network. This is how SIM evolved as a secure identifier, secure identity module, right? To make sure that the security is really strong. And has evolved over many years. And once you have that on the device, like for instance an iSIM, it's integrated. Yes, it is doing your network authentication. But it's also can be used for other things. We have an initiative called IoT Safe. together with the GSMA, where you effectively use that little crypto box, little crypto vault, if you will, on your device for other things. And in that case, we're kind of restoring your TLS certificate, which is your communication certificate. So you could now directly go to your cloud vendor and take this device and be recognized as a secure and trusted device and enroll straight into their communication layer. And once you have that, you can go up to the next level. Actually, the same crypto vault, if you will, can be used for the root of trust, which effectively means signing the whole device. I'm sure your listeners know some of this, but it's good to reiterate. So signing the whole device. Sure. So it also gives you very strong kind of rollout to the rest of the device. So you start in the network, that's very important, but then actually you can build up to the rest of what the device is doing and make the device really trusted and strongly defended. Similarly, the SIM also has there's management software for the eSIM. And again, that management software can be used to make sure that the eSIM is up to date, that the secure OS on the eSIM or iSIM is up to date. So again, this is over-the-air update. It's also kind of automatically designed into this security solution.
Fantastic. So now we've kind of covered at least a high level what you all do. We talked a little bit about security. Tell me about any use cases, deployments, initiatives on the IoT front that are out in the real world that you guys are proud of, that you're comfortable talking about on the podcast, just to kind of bring this all full circle so our audience can kind of see how your offering is being used out in the market right now.
Sure. Cellular IoT, right, has a big advantage. The biggest advantage is that you don't have to get onto someone's Wi-Fi. It just connects out of the box anywhere in the world. I think that is the key use case for cellular IoT. But now, if you look at a 4G modem in your mobile phone, that's probably an order of magnitude more expensive than something you can use today. So as an industry, we've been pushing really hard to get that price down, to make it more usable, but not only get the price down, also get the size down. Because clearly a mobile phone has a certain size, but if you go to IoT devices, they can be a lot smaller. The use cases kind of require you to be a lot smaller. And that is one of our initiatives around iSIM, right? The integration of the SIM into the other chips helps with that form factor. That's a bit of a long answer, but I'll get there. So once you look at the form factor, so it gets smaller. So this opens up new use cases. The way I kind of like to describe it. Remember the iPod? The iPod was a massive change because Apple realized that the small hard drives could be embedded into a music player. Now with iSIM and the making smaller of the radio, we can actually start putting this radio into much smaller use cases. And one of the use cases we're really proud of is with Sony. It's called a smart tracker. It's effectively a tracker which is printed plastic. So everything's plastic, everything's printed. The battery is printed. The circuit board is printed. Everything is printed apart from the chip. The one chip you want to stick on there. Clearly, you don't want to have 2 or 3 chips because now every chip has the problem of making sure it sticks right. So you don't want too many brittle solid parts. So you take one chip and then effectively everything is printed. Now this is used for very high and at the moment very high value tracking. Think about vaccines, right? Very nice example at the moment. Some of the vaccines have to be minus Fahrenheit, Celsius, but anyway, minus 20, minus 40 Celsius. I think that is something like minus 20 Fahrenheit. And how do you make sure that when you're tracking it and you're moving into your logistics chain, how do you make sure it actually was in the right condition? And when it arrives, that you signify the user or the owner of the package that it has arrived. So that's a really nice use case where you can see that the smallness of iSIM is really driving and opening up new use cases. I have a few more if you want me to just keep going. Or you want
Yeah. No, we love use cases. So yeah, I'd love to hear more.
The other one is, I can't name the manufacturer, but I know some manufacturers are trialing something called hair as a service. So what is hair as a service? You ask, are good hair as a service? It's effectively a hair straightener. I'm not sure if you're familiar with these, but a lot of women use them to straighten their hair. And in that hair straightener, there's actually a lot of sensors. And the sensors can do things like determine the dryness of the hair, the thickness of the hair, the burntness of the hair. And if you can communicate that back to the factory, right, back to the supplier, you can actually start offering other services. You can offer services for things like better products to make sure if your hair is dry, maybe you want to use this. If your hair is too fatty, maybe you want to use this. So you can see it becomes now a kind of good hair as a service, we call that. And again, those hair straighteners are quite small, so you don't have a lot of space. You do have a lot of power, but from a space point of view, that's kind of an interesting use case that make me giggle. So that's why I bring it up regularly. Other ones are more in the industrial automation, things about chemical meters, water meters, where things have to operate on a battery. iSIM standby power is about 1/10 of the standby power of a normal SIM. So again, it helps you lengthen that battery life to 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. So that's another kind of use cases we're seeing quite a lot of people using.
Great. So when we talk about kind of cellular IoT in a general sense, are there any, I guess, how would you kind of distinguish between the types of use cases that are best suited for cellular IoT as a connectivity option, as opposed to other connectivity options out there like LPWAN, things like that? Options like LoRa and so forth. Like how would you kind of, if you were talking to somebody to say cellular is best for these types of use cases, it may not be as best suited for these types of use cases, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. So generally, I think cellular is best for anything that Wi-Fi is also used for today. And the benefits over Wi-Fi are that it connects everywhere. So you don't have to have an enter password, because that's where the SIM is for. That the identity strongly defended, built into the device. So most of them are talking to a washing machine vendor, and they have Wi-Fi in the washing machine. I know if you have Wi-Fi in your washing machine, I do. I have not connected them to a network because I can't see the use for me as a consumer, but actually from a manufacturer point of view, they would like to understand my usage. And the fact that I don't put it on the Wi-Fi is annoying for them because they can't get the usage. So if they had a LPWAN solution, like a 4G or 5G, low power wide area network cellular IoT, then they could actually get that information, and they could understand how the machine is used, how to improve their machine, how to maybe even get some advertising, a little screen onto the washing machine. So that's really useful. Now, the thing that's holding it back, obviously, what's the downside? Why is not everybody doing that? Is currently because the price point is a little higher than Wi-Fi. Now, that is coming down really quickly, and I think that's what the industry is really focusing on around the low power cellular IoT networks to make sure that price point becomes very competitive to Wi-Fi. And in that case, then you start using Wi-Fi on those low bandwidth kind of solutions. If you compare to other networks like Bluetooth, well, clearly Bluetooth is a very different radio standard, much more for short distance, but also way lower power. Right? So Bluetooth is probably not something that is good to go into that area. I think LoRa you mentioned. So LoRa is interesting, but LoRa needs its own base stations. So LoRa doesn't work everywhere in the world, and LoRa is probably more if you are on an industrial site and you have your own LoRa network. That might be very possible, but then you put your own little LoRa base stations in, maybe your shopping mall. That is really feasible, but you can't then benefit from taking this same gadget and moving it to a different country or a different environment, because obviously unless you take the base station with it. Right? I think that's the strength of the cellular IoT. Does that make sense?
Gotcha. Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. No, that's great. I appreciate you breaking that down.
Sure.
And we hear a lot about just cellular IoT in general and kind of how it's on the rise, with 5G and so forth. And how do you think about the factors that are contributing to the rise of cellular IoT? Is this an advent of 5G, or is there something else that's really contributing to it?
It depends a little bit on the use case, right? So if you look at the low power use case, the small data use case, I think it's the advent of the Cat-M modems, or the narrowband IoT modems. So it's the really low power, low throughput modems. I think in IoT very interesting because very nice. If you look at a smart meter, it doesn't need a high pipe. It doesn't need a big 4G, 5G high end pipe to transport this data. 5G is integrating some of this, right? The low power radios, the low bandwidth radios is kind of be native to the 5G standard. So that is kind of really allowing that really to take off. Again, those radios tend to be a lot lower price points. The connections tend to be a lot lower price points, so much more suitable and feasible for IoT. And then clearly, the more specialized use cases in 5G is the high bandwidth, where you can have your private network, but still have your device also work on a public network. The kind of other things the operators can offer to make sure that they use the bandwidth better and more targeted at 5G at IoT. I'm not an expert in that. More looking at the security side, but we are seeing quite a lot of new use cases. And it's quite interesting to talk to different vendors.
That's fantastic. And can you give an overview to our audience kind of the hardware and software like requirements or the needs for cellular IoT when they're kind of thinking about putting together a solution? You know, what's needed on their side and what's needed kind of from an infrastructure standpoint to make this work?
So on the device side, they're effectively, you need 3 chips. You need a application chip, which runs maybe Linux or an RTOS. You tend to need a radio chip from one of the large radio makers or the small innovators, and then you need a security chip, a SIM. Now, some radio makers offer a 3-in-1. So they have both the application processor, the radio, and the SIM, the iSIM in that case, all 3-in-1. So you need 1 chip instead of 3. Obviously, a lot easier because it's pre-integrated, and you don't need a lot. You go to a module maker, like for instance, Murata. Murata has just announced one of their low power modules, which effectively is 3-in-1. So a very, very small module. We also had a SIMCOM module recently announced, very small near-band IoT radio. So that is effectively on the device side, and they include also the application processor. So you can start running small OSs on that and really drive then the form factor. Now, clearly you need an antenna because that's important, but you need it for any radio. And then obviously a connectivity to a network to make sure that you have coverage either in the region you're in or maybe a large worldwide offering from an MVNO that you have now coverage around the world. I think that's the interesting part, that you can have a one SKU, create something in Taiwan, ship it to Canada or to Australia. It will just work no matter where it goes without having to do a lot of complicated SKU management.
Great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And when it comes to kind of the verticals that we are seeing, maybe the earliest adoption or that stand to gain the most from this transition into more cellular IoT applications being deployed, where do you see any verticals that are kind of standing out, or do you see any verticals that I guess are primed to benefit the most from this as it becomes more popular and 5G gets out there even more and so forth?
I think all the verticals. That's not an interesting answer. So the thing we're seeing is medical trackers. So I think it's initially a lot around trackers. We're seeing kind of a couple of companies working. It's like your smartwatch, but then medically standalone, doesn't need your phone anymore anywhere in the world. That's kind of a really interesting use case we're seeing. Again, for a medical tracker, think about a Fitbit, but then a medical version of it. That has to be really small, has to be really light, but it has to kind of not use a lot of battery, but usable around the world. The other thing is what we call micro-mobility, scooters. We've seen a lot of scooters coming with, you want to be able to deploy a scooter in any city around the world. And your startup of scooters, you have big plans. So you definitely want to be able to connect everywhere with the same hardware. So we're seeing scooters as a prime example, not as much around the form factor, because clearly there's enough space on the scooter, but maybe the battery life and the integration, the iSIM and the eSIM really offers a benefit, as well as the cellular IoT. Gotcha. So those are kind of use cases we're really seeing taking off very rapidly.
Okay, that's great. And you mentioned throughout our conversation, when we're talking about SIMs, you talked about eSIMs, you talked about iSIMs. Can you just again iterate on just what the difference between people hear eSIMs versus iSIMs, and if kind of how they differ, if at all?
Sure. No, they differ. And I went over it really fast. So let's start with a SIM. Right? A SIM is the thing that you put in your mobile phone, right? And that's great. Again, trusted. People use it. It's been attacked many times, defended many times. So it's shown that the tracks in the industry that this is a really secure solution. The drawback of a SIM, it's quite large. Right? It takes up a lot of space because you need a little tray for the SIM to slide into. Secondly, the power usage is quite high because the tray doesn't have a really good electrical connection. And thirdly, the tray, designers drives them furious to have a hole in their beautiful design. Or if you're in industrial, there might be dust or water coming into that hole, so that's not perfect. Also, when you're industrial and you're somewhere in a big machine, having to change the SIM card because you are your operator changes or you get a better deal or they go out of business isn't really isn't ideal. So the industry came with something which is called an eSIM. Okay. Now, eSIM is that same SIM card, but then take away the plastic and solder it down onto the motherboard of the device. Right? If you have like a PC motherboard or a phone, very similar, so it's a little motherboard for an IoT device, they solder it down.
Right.
But when they solder it down, you can no longer change this SIM when you change supplier. So what then happens is they have a very secure server called an RSP, remote SIM provisioning server, that manages that eSIM. So when you want to change supplier, that server can then effectively download a new profile. We call that, and the profile is, for instance, now if you go from T-Mobile to AT&T, or for Vodafone or to Orange, you can download a new profile, and that then enables new connectivity. That's done a really high secure. The eSIM is a lot more secure than the SIM itself, because it has a different use case and can move around the world. Now, iSIM is that same eSIM, but instead of soldered down onto the motherboard, you now integrate it into one of the other chips. So the chip itself disappears and becomes part of a larger chip. It's still all there. All the security defenses are still there. It's just in the corner of a larger chip. Say the radio chip is the most obvious solution for this, but it could be the power usage chip or the application processor chip. There are multiple ways, but it effectively disappears and becomes a corner of another chip.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I appreciate you breaking that down. The last question I wanted to ask you before we kind of wrap up here is, a lot of our audience out there, is involved in IoT deployments, whether they're working with a company to have a solution built or they're doing it themselves. So how does a company know where to start when they're kind of embarking on their cellular IoT journey? Just kind of any advice, talk about kind of that starting period, what they should be thinking about, and then just general advice they should have throughout the process to maybe avoid any common pitfalls, anything like that, just to kind of ensure better success when they're getting involved in cellular IoT.
Yeah, so I think now the key thing is to start with module makers, right? Module makers effectively create the little module, which is the radio chip, maybe with an application chip, but the radio chip for you. That's kind of something you can then put onto your design. Because making radios is quite hard. And the module maker has done all the hard work. They have not only created the module, they have tested the module, and they have now got an approval from the MNO to actually use that module onto their network. So especially for the low volumes, it doesn't make sense to create your own module. You just go to the large module makers. We got Murata, Simcom, Quicktale, or many different ones. You kind of look at the different aspects you want. When you want a high throughput radio, low throughput radio, what about power usage? Those things you look at and you integrate it. Now, if you were at some point as a startup become the size of Apple, then clearly you design everything yourself. But I think initially you just use that module up to quite high volumes before that makes sense to take that module apart and put it on your own design. Because again, that is quite complicated. And those module makers have development boards, things you can try. So you can now start rigging up some of your design in the lab, clearly not on the same small form factor, but to making sure that functionally it all functions.
Fantastic. Yeah. That's been great. This conversation has been very insightful. I really appreciate you taking the time to kind of break down cellular IoT to this level and kind of talk about how it applies, where it's, where we see the growth, the future of it, and that kind of thing. I do want to ask that if anybody out there is listening and wants to learn more about kind of what you all have going on, has any follow-up questions, what's the best way to reach out and engage?
So we are quite active on LinkedIn. So we have a page on LinkedIn, Kigen, on LinkedIn, or Kigen.com, our website. And also feel free to email me directly, Vincent.Korstanje@Kigen.com. More than happy to maybe, I might not be the right person to answer your question, but more than happy to redirect your questions. But again, we are quite active on social media on the LinkedIn side. So more than happy to have a conversation in public or in private if you want that, to that, reaching out via our email addresses.
Fantastic. And any news or any announcements coming out of the company in the coming months so that our audience should be on the lookout for?
Yes, we have quite a few, which obviously now, because they aren't announced yet, there are secrets. But now we have so a couple of the large MNOs are working with us. We're seeing a good traction, so we'll be announcing that. We have already announced the Simcom and the Murata modules we work with. We are looking at other module makers, so they'll be announcing. And obviously now, just like you, we are very excited about use cases. I know a couple of use cases around dog trackers, like a Fitbit for your dog, to make sure that your dog sleeps enough. Which in my case, my dog sleeps all the time, so I'm sure it's fine. But a couple of these things, kind of interesting use cases where they take these things down to kind of a much smaller level, which is really interesting for us to see what we can enable. The iPod moment. It is really what I'm looking forward to in the market. And we're seeing more and more people starting to think differently and actually use cellular IoT where they previously weren't even thinking of that.
Fantastic. Well, Vincent, this has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate your time and kind of shedding light on a lot of different topics connected to cellular IoT. Really appreciate you being here. And thanks again.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And if you ever have more questions, more than happy to appear again.
Absolutely. We'd love to have you back. All right, everyone. Thanks again for joining us this week on the IoT For All podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please leave us a rating or review and be sure to subscribe to our podcast on whichever platform you're listening to us on. Also, if you have a guest you'd like to see on the show, please drop us a note at ryan@iotforall.com and we'll do everything we can to get them as a featured guest. Other than that, thanks again for listening and we'll see you next time.